It is the late 1800s. You are on a train bound northward from Dunedin, New Zealand. Outside, you are surrounded by farmland, interrupted only by patches of pristine wilderness and coastline. The train pulls up at a station in a small settlement that most wouldn't give more than a fleeting thought to. A kind of blink and you miss it town. This, however, is your destination. You see, this settlement shares a secret. Despite the already well-established and quickly booming cities of the British colony, the settlement of Seacliff, which today has an approximate population of 100 people, was once home to the largest building in New Zealand. So you've all read the title, you know what I'm doing, but I think it would be wrong to make a video about the Seacliff Lunatic Asylum without first giving at least a brief overview of its history. Now, at the time of Seacliff's construction, Dunedin already had its own psychiatric hospital. However, it suffered from significant overcrowding due to the increase in population caused by the Otago gold rush. Additionally, it was now too close to the public eye, meaning that it was no longer serving what many would argue was the primary purpose of psychiatric hospitals: to keep the undesirable out of sight and out of mind. The location of Seacliff was perfect. The land at the time was undeveloped, with no roads leading in or out, and being 30 kilometres from Dunedin, it was close enough for ease of transportation and far enough away to avoid any grievances from the public. The new asylum was designed by Scottish-born architect Robert Lawson, who was notable for having designed just about every historic building in Dunedin, such as Fresh Church, Knox Church, Otago Boys High School, Larnach Castle, and also this church in Milton for some reason. I guess it really is the town of opportunities. And also prison. Lawson absolutely went to town on this one, and he even wanted to have these other two massive blocks built on either side of the asylum. Measuring at 225 metres long by 67 metres wide and absolutely bedazzled in turrets, the Seacliff Lunatic Asylum could easily be mistaken for a more depressing version of Hogwarts that swaps witchcraft and wizardry for sedatives and schizophrenia. However, it wasn't all fun and games. Structural faults began to appear due to the asylum having been built on unstable land, and large swaths of the building had to be completely replaced. The new asylum, like its predecessor, also became almost immediately overcrowded upon the completion of its construction in 1884, and the additional buildings were later required on the grounds to cater to this demand. I think the fact that it became overcrowded actually says less about the mental health of New Zealanders at the time and more about how wide the government's definition of madness was. On one hand, you had people sent to Seacliff such as Lionel Terry, an English white supremacist and murderer who was later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. But on the other hand, you had people sent there due to suffering from epilepsy, postnatal depression, being a woman who doesn't know how to dress herself properly. Today there are a lot of people who advocate for a return to the institutionalization model for mental health, who claim that community-based care has resulted in them feeling unsafe, and I totally get that community-based care is imperfect, but I think you just need to take a look at the reasons why people used to be institutionalized in the first place, and recognize that you most likely know somebody who would have fallen into the broad definition of madness had they been born in the 1800s. Tragically, at around 9:45 p.m. on the 8th of December 1942, a fire in one of the new buildings known as Ward 5 broke out. The patients, all of whom were women, were locked in their rooms, and most of the rooms had their shutters locked. Only 2 of the patients in Ward 5 survived, while the remaining 37 to 39 patients were killed. Eventually, due to further earth movement, the main building of Seacliff was demolished in 1959, and the hospital was officially closed in 1973. Brought on in part by an 1888 inquiry which found him to be somewhat responsible for a landslide which had occurred a year earlier, Robert Lawson's reputation was diminished, and he departed for Melbourne in 1890. It was important for this project that I choose a specific point in time due to how the building evolved over time. I chose to model it as it was roughly in the late 30s to early 40s, as by this point the tower had not yet been demolished, but the building had been around for long enough for some of the cracks to begin to open. The Hocken Library was an excellent resource for this project, as I was able to find not only detailed floor plans and other architectural drawings, but also photographs that were taken at multiple different periods in time, showing the building from pretty much all angles, as well as a whole series which were taken for the specific purpose of documenting the damage. I spent a good amount of time at the start sifting through these images, eventually bringing them into a PureRef file. When I started this project, I'd also wanted to model the interior as well. However, with little more than a few floor plans and some photographs of only one of the rooms to go off of, as well as the enormous undertaking this would be, I eventually decided to limit myself just to the exterior. I'd also considered modeling some of the buildings which were added on later, but for the same reasons as before, I realized this would prove to be a huge challenge. I definitely would consider doing this in the future, but at the moment I have no real plans to do so. After this, I brought the first floor plan into Maya and set up the project to use imperial measurements rather than metric, and I began to block out the structure. It was important during this process not to rely too much on the floor plans, as the measurements were not necessarily the final measurements which were used. I found multiple places where the numbers simply did not add up or were not provided at all, so in a lot of places I just kind of guessed the measurements. I also brought this photograph into a free program called F-Spy, which allows you to essentially get the focal length of a photo based on perspective lines. I then created a new camera in Maya using the new focal length and tried to set it up so that it was matched to the model. I was also able to just barely make out an outline of a floor plan on Google Maps on the site where the asylum used to be, so I also overlaid this as another reference image. I then turned my attention into adding details to the model. I decided to start with the clock tower, which actually never had a clock installed in it at all, instead being boarded up with what looks to me to be wooden planks. These images from the Hocken Library were enormously valuable for modelling the clock tower, and it allowed me to achieve a much greater level of accuracy. I then turned my attention to modelling the central block. I focused first on modelling the windows, and I made sure to have the window surrounds as separate objects with a partial amount of depth to ensure both that it would be easy to assign a different material to it later, as well as to have it not quite perfectly flat with the rest of the building. This recent article in the Otago Daily Times was particularly useful for learning about how the building was constructed, and I learned from this that the window surrounds and other architectural details were made from Oamaru stone, a common building material typically found on older buildings in the South Island, and the stone blocks making up the rest of the building are not actually stone blocks at all, but rather cement plaster with scribed outlines with brickwork underneath. After having modelled the main aspects of the central block, I then moved on to adding details to the rest of the model. The whole process sped up considerably from here, as at this point I was mostly just reusing and adapting pieces that I had already modelled. I had to be careful with this section, as I could see in some images that the windows were much longer than in others. The ODT article informs me that this change was made sometime after 1884, due in part to not enough light being allowed into the building. This is why it was important to pick a time period early on, so I modelled it with these renovations included. For the back section I had pretty much no reference images to go off of, so I had to rely quite heavily on the floor plans. There was this pretty interesting looking covered way around the back, which there seems to be no photographs of anywhere, so it was quite cool to see this come to life. There were quite a few decorative shields on the gables, and I looked for quite a while to see if I could find what the design on them would have been. The closest I could find was from an architectural plan of another building at Seacliff, although it was still impossible to make out at all. I decided to leave the shields blank and use normal maps later when texturing. For this decorative design on the central block gable, I decided to simply use a height map that I found on this random Russian forum that sort of resembles the original design. I used a displacement modifier in Blender on a subdivided plane, then deleted the unnecessary geometry before doing a little bit of sculpting work and bringing it back into Maya. I'm sure there's a way of doing something similar in Maya, but I found this to be the quickest and most effective way at the time. After I had modelled all of the left-hand side of the building, I duplicated everything over to the other side. But the modelling wasn't quite finished there, as this section of the building ended up being demolished and replaced with a new structure in 1889. I didn't have any architectural plans to go off of for this section, but I was able to overlay an image of it onto the other plans to get a fairly rough model of it. I have no idea what it looked like around the back, so I pretty much just kept it the same as the front of the structure. Other than that, there isn't really much else to say about the modelling, which feels a bit strange to say as this was by far the longest part of the process. The next stage, however, was the most soul-crushing. Okay, it wasn't that bad, but it did take a lot longer than I'd hoped it would. For anyone who doesn't know, UV unwrapping is the process of taking a 3D model and making cuts on it so that it's able to be unfolded to display a 2D texture. This meant that for every piece on the building, I was going to have to manually prepare them for texturing. In hindsight, I definitely should have been unwrapping as I was going, as probably the majority of the time was spent copying UVs over from one object to all of its duplicates. For some reason in Maya, the Transfer Attributes tool only lets you do this on one object at a time, but fortunately Nesta Prado on Tumblr wrote this simple Python script which solves the issue almost 13 years ago. Why is this not already a built-in feature? Another reason why I should have been unwrapping and modeling simultaneously was because I would have found earlier on that not only were there faces inside of the window frames that shouldn't have been there, but there was also an edge which I must have accidentally deleted, resulting in an n-gon. I had hoped that I'd just be able to use the Replace Objects tool to swap out all of the other window frames, but for whatever reason this didn't work and it just ended up deleting the object. I asked ChatGPT about this, which recommended that alongside doing all of the usual things such as freezing transformations and deleting history, I test using primitives first, which worked fine. It then gave me a Python script which does exactly the same thing as the built-in Replace Objects tool does, but this was to no avail. Eventually I decided that I was just going to have to replace each object by duplicating the first model, using match transformations, deleting the other model, and then repeating this until I had replaced all of the window frames. This was definitely quite time consuming, but it actually didn't add up to too much more time when considering that to use the Replace Objects tool, I would have had to have selected all of the window frames anyway. Once I had unwrapped all of the pieces, I needed to lay out all of the UV islands so that they weren't overlapping. As this was going to be a large model, I knew that I was going to need to use multiple UDIMs, and I settled on using 16 separate tiles for this. The layout UV tools took absolutely forever, which is unsurprising considering that it was processing this for well over 10,000 individual objects. However, it really didn't seem to be making the most of the texture space at all. I found a couple of objects that had UV islands with an X scale of 0, so my guess is that the tool was trying to scale them up further and further to try and match the texture density of the other islands, but due to anything being multiplied by 0 being 0, it would continue to increase the scale of these islands until it reached the boundaries of the tile. There were also a few objects that I was able to optimize better by adding more cuts, which allowed me to get much more texel density out of the tiles. It seemed that the layout tool didn't do a perfect job of matching the texel density of all of the objects, but overall it was close enough, so I simply moved on to the texturing stage. It wasn't quite finished there as I got this error message when I imported the model into Substance Painter, but I quickly found the culprit and I was just able to move on. Texturing the building was definitely one of the more rewarding stages of the project, and it was really when I was able to see it start to come to life. There were plenty of photos online showing the only remaining above ground ruin from Seacliff, which would have provided perfect reference for creating either a procedural stone brick texture, or for finding a PBR image texture set to use as a base, but I wanted to try something a little different. I decided to go and photo scan these ruins at Seacliff, and then created normal displacement and color maps from the scan. To do this, I simply used the camera app on my phone to take a bunch of photos of the ruin while the sun was behind a cloud so that I would avoid any harsh shadows on the model. Then back home, I imported these images into Reality Capture, which generated a 3D model. I then imported this model from Reality Capture into Maya, and I set up the front orthographic camera to try and be as level as possible with the brickwork, and to try and achieve something that was at least partially seamless. I plugged the image texture into the emission, and in the Arnold render settings I set up separate AOVs for emission, normal, and depth, which essentially allowed me to render up separate images for the color map, normal map, and height map. This wasn't going to be seamless by default, so inside of Substance Painter I used a plane as a mesh and brought in all of the rendered images. Using the clone brush tool, I was able to both hide the seams in the texture, as well as to hide the part of the ruin which looked to be where a window was removed and the hole filled in with new brickwork. I also hid a lot of cracks and any kind of high contrast, out of place type parts of the texture so that it wouldn't be as noticeable when I later tiled it. I also knew that I wanted to add these details in myself once I was working on the full mesh. After this, I was able to export these textures and import them into the full mesh in Substance Painter, being sure to change the projection type to triplanar to avoid inconsistent texture sizes brought on by the differences in the texel density, as well as to ensure that the textures were all rotated the correct way. Was any of this necessary at all? Absolutely not. Does it make this project any more novel? A little bit. I did quite a lot of tweaking on the colours to try and make it match a bit better, although this proved to be rather difficult, as all that I really had as colour reference was the ruin. I I brought this image of a painting into PureF, which I'm guessing was commissioned by Robert Lawson or some other party during the planning stage, due to the fact that it features the extra blocks on either side which were never built. I thought it could have been somewhat helpful for colour reference, but the note I left myself to take it with a grain of salt could not have been more of an understatement. I was mostly reliant on guesswork in determining the colours, but I also decided to try and feed some of the clearer photographs into an AI image colorizer. Like with the painting, this was definitely something to take with a grain of salt, but the colours actually seemed to be pretty consistent from image to image, and they felt to me to be believable. As I previously mentioned, Wamaru stone was used on all of the window surrounds and a lot of other architectural details. Fortunately, I had an Wamaru stone carving that I made a few years ago, so I just took a photo of the back of it on my phone and fed it into a free program called Materialize, where I was able to create a quick and easy seamless PBR texture set from this photo. Wamaru stone has quite an iconic look to it when it becomes weathered, so I made sure to include this detail in the texture. These images taken of some of the gables were particularly useful for seeing the texture up close. I also added some general weathering onto the cement plaster and the roof, and I made some pretty simple materials for the window frames, glass, and all other parts of the model. The series that I found documenting the damage that was occurring to the building as a result of the unstable land was very useful for showing me exactly where the cracks were occurring. I tried to keep as close to this as I could, trying to make sure that I wasn't making the building look too damaged, otherwise this could easily be perceived as propaganda, especially considering that institutionalization is such a politically divisive issue. Once I had finished texturing, I exported all 80 textures, and in Maya I loaded in just the base color so that I could visualize the model. I duplicated the other half of the building over again, and I fixed up some of the issues that I found when texturing, such as that the new corridor didn't connect up properly, and there were also a couple of missing window frames. After this, I exported the model and imported it into Unreal Engine, where I was then going to begin to work on the environment. Or it would have been if Unreal Engine didn't crash every time I loaded it into the scene. I guess that was to be expected though, considering the insane poly count. Importing the model itself worked fine, but whenever I dragged and dropped each of the objects into the scene, it would freeze for about 10 minutes before crashing. At this stage, I wasn't really sure if Unreal Engine was going to be able to handle it at all, or whether I just have to sacrifice the real-time rendering aspect and just accept whatever kind of insane render times Unreal will give me instead. Nevertheless, I did a bit of googling and I found one forum post that suggested that Unreal Engine 5.3, which is what I was using, seemed to struggle importing in large models when compared with 5.1. I decided to update to 5.5 instead in the hopes that perhaps the developers had fixed this issue in new updates, and I would always be able to install 5.1 if that didn't work. And unsurprisingly, it didn't work. I wasn't totally convinced that switching back to 5.1 would solve the problem, and I had found a possible solution on another forum post which suggested changing the minimum of free virtual and physical memory in the base editor.ini file from 2048 to 256. To my immense relief, this ended up working. Importing the textures was a bit of a challenge as well, as Unreal Engine isn't automatically equipped to deal with the UDIMs, but it was really just a matter of enabling this in the settings and also changing these other weird settings so that it wasn't trying to recalculate the textures every 5 seconds. It was really satisfying at this point seeing it all come together. One thing I'd hoped to achieve early on was to have the real-world height data in the scene. You can do this using the landscape tools in Unreal Engine, but I'm not totally sure whether you can also import the satellite imagery over the top, so I decided to use the Blender OSM add-on to do this. I kept the scale down to only a few kilometers, as I knew that I wouldn't be showing overly much of the landscape. I then imported the model into Unreal Engine and aligned it with the position of Seacliff. I didn't need to do any kind of scaling to it, as everything was already using real-world units. It was pretty satisfying being able to explore the landscape, and to see that the hill in the background was aligned pretty much perfectly with the hill in the photos. I tweaked the model a little bit just so that the earth around the building was more or less how it was in real life. Obviously, the texture from the satellite imagery wasn't at a very high resolution, so I needed to scatter some assets in the foreground to make it feel more realistic. Using aerial photographs of Seacliff as a guide, I used an asset I had found of a riverbed, and used the foliage brush to essentially paint the paths onto the terrain. I then did the same thing with some grass and bushes assets, and I also added the climbers onto the building, which seemed to start growing there sometime in the early 20th century. There were also some cabbage trees that I saw in some references on the grounds on the north end of the building. I found this really great model on Sketchfab, which I imported and matched to the position of the real trees as best as I could. I also saw quite a few photos with old cars parked outside of it, which I thought would make a cool addition. I spent hours scouring the internet before coming across the perfect model of a Holden sedan, which I already happen to have saved onto my hard drive, because I made it. Anyway, if anyone's interested, you can pick it up on cgtrader.com for $15. And that's pretty much it. There's still so much that I'd like to have done on this, such as modelling the interior and modelling all of the other buildings, but I'd just end up spending months and months working on that, and then I might not have released anything at all. Speaking of which, I've decided to put the model up on a shared Google Drive folder if you're interested in checking it out. Other than that, thanks very much for watching.